Hey guys, this is Melissa with Love Covered Life, and today we're going to talk about one of the scariest subjects in the Bible, and one of the main proof texts used to support the idea of eternal conscious torment in hell, the lake of fire. This is actually going to be a two-part series. Today we're going to start with learning some very interesting things about where the phrase the lake of fire came from. In the Bible, the phrase lake of fire is found in Revelations chapter 19 and 20. I will read chapter 20 verses 12 to 15 to you here. I saw the dead, both great and small, standing before God's throne, and the books were opened, including the book of life. And the dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. The sea gave up its dead, and death and the grave gave up their dead, and all were judged according to their deeds. Then death and the grave were thrown into the lake of fire. This lake of fire is the second death, and anyone whose name was not found recorded in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. Revelation 14, verses 9 through 11 is generally understood to be speaking of the lake of fire, even though that isn't actually stated in the passage. Anyone who worships the beast and his statue, or who accepts his mark on the forehead or on the hand, must drink the wine of God's anger. It has been poured full strength into God's cup of wrath, and they will be tormented with fire and burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and the Lamb. The smoke of their torment will rise forever and ever, and they will have no relief day or night, for they have worshipped the beast and his statue and have accepted the mark of his name. I just recently learned that there is actually a lot of historical context on this term, the lake of fire. So today I'm going to take you on a journey with me to see exactly where this phrase, the lake of fire, came from. To begin this journey, we have to go all the way back to Genesis chapter 19. Genesis 19, 24 through 28. Then the Lord rained down fire and burning sulfur from the sky on Sodom and Gomorrah. He utterly destroyed them, along with the other cities and villages of the plain, wiping out all the people and every bit of vegetation. But Lot's wife looked back as she was following behind him, and she turned into a pillar of salt. Abraham got up early that morning and hurried out to the place where he had stood in the Lord's presence. He looked out across the plain toward Sodom and Gomorrah and watched as columns of smoke rose from the cities like smoke from a furnace. We see here mentions of fire, sulfur, and columns of smoke rising as if from a furnace. Also, the fact that Lot's wife is said to have turned into a pillar of salt is an important point to remember. Now let's move to Genesis chapter 14, where we are told where Sodom and Gomorrah was located. After Abraham and Lot separated, and Lot chose to live in Sodom, war broke out in that region, and we are told that the war took place in the valley of Sodom, which was located by the Dead Sea. Verse 10, As it happened, the valley of the Dead Sea was filled with tar pits, and as the army of the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into the tar pits, while the rest escaped into the mountains. So here we learn that Sodom and Gomorrah was located in the Dead Sea area, and that the Sodom Valley by the Dead Sea was filled with tar pits. Today, geologists say that the area surrounding the Dead Sea is known for its earthquakes. It is situated on fault lines, and there are also volcanic vents in the area. The tar pits referenced in Genesis were dug by the ancient people who lived there for the collection of tar or asphalt, which was a thriving industry at the time. It has been theorized that an earthquake could have set off a volcano, and that this fiery volcanic destruction could have been the judgment that fell on Sodom. Also, volcanic activity could have set the tar on fire, which would have produced a thick black smoke. Even today, asphalt seeps up from underground and floats on the surface of the Dead Sea. So theoretically, if the floating asphalt burned during the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the Dead Sea itself could have appeared to have been on fire, hence the term lake of fire. There are numerous historical references to the fact that the area surrounding the Dead Sea was burning for years, centuries even, after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. These sources speak of a subterranean fire burning continually, leading to smoke rising day and night. They speak of sulfur, tar pits, and salt. In fact, the reason the Dead Sea is called the Dead Sea is because it is a salt sea. sea. There was no outlet, and it was so full of salt that nothing could live in it. Here's a few of the historical descriptions of the Dead Sea area. The Wisdom of Solomon from the 2nd century BC. Wisdom saved a man, Lot, from destruction of the godless, and he escaped the fire that came down on the 5 cities, cities whose wickedness is still attested by a smoking waste. Diodorus Siculus, in approximately 60 to 30 BC, the fire which burns beneath the ground and the stench render the inhabitants of the neighboring countries sickly and very short-lived. Strabo, in 63 to 64 BC to AD 24. Many other evidences are produced to show that the country around the Dead Sea area is fiery. In many places, fissures and ashy soil and drops of pitch that emit foul odors to a great distance, and ruined settlements here and there. And therefore people believe the oft-repeated assertions of the local inhabitants that there were once 13 inhabited cities in that region, of which Sodom was the metropolis, and that by reason of earthquakes and of eruptions of fire and of hot waters containing asphalt and sulfur, the lake burst its bounds and rocks were enveloped with fire, and as for the cities, some were swallowed up and others were abandoned by such as were able to escape. Philo of Alexandria, 20 BC to AD 50, speaking of the destruction of Sodom. And when the flames had consumed everything that was visible and that existed on the face of the earth, they proceeded to burn even the earth itself, penetrating into its lowest recesses and destroying all the vivifying powers which existed within it, so as to produce a complete and everlasting barrenness, so that it should never again be able to bear fruit. And to this very day it is scorched up. For the fire of the lightning is what is most difficult to extinguish, and it creeps on, pervading everything and smoldering. And a most evident proof of this is to be found in what is seen to this day, for the smoke which is still emitted and the sulfur which men dig up there are a proof of the calamity which befell that country. Josephus says, speaking of Sodom, it was burnt by lightning, in consequence of which there are still the remainders of that divine fire, and the traces of the 5 cities are still to be seen, as well as the ashes growing in their fruits. And as late as AD 1787, an explorer by the name of Volney writes, "The south of Syria, that is, the hollow through which the Jordan flows, is a country of volcanoes. The bituminous and sulfurous sources of the lake Asphaltus, which was their name for the Dead Sea, the lava, the pumice stones thrown upon its bank, and the hot baths of Tiberias demonstrate that this valley has been the seat of subterranean fire which is not yet extinguished. Clouds of smoke are often observed to issue from the lake, and the new crevices to be formed upon its banks." William Lynch, when he visited the area in 1848 AD, said, "At one time today the sea assumed an aspect peculiarly somber. The great evaporation enveloped it in a thin, transparent vapor, its purple tinge contrasting strangely with the extraordinary color of the sea beneath, and where they blended in the distance, giving it the appearance of smoke from burning sulfur. It seemed a vast cauldron of metal, fused but motionless. In the afternoon of the same day it looked like molten lead. At night it had the exact hue of absinthe or wormwood." He's also quoted as saying, "A strong smell of sulphuret hydrogen, a fetid sulphurous odor in the night. The north wind was quite fresh and accompanied with a smell of sulfur." So it seems, based on these sources, that in the centuries after the destruction, there may have been a continuously burning subterranean fire in the area. As time went on, the smoke and fire was visible less and less often, but would appear again at random. It's been said that maps made up until the 1700s were depicted with smoke rising over the Dead Sea area. So because Sodom continued to burn for centuries after the judgment, the destruction of Sodom had a huge impact in shaping human ideas about divine judgment, which we'll get more into in the next video. People came to associate divine judgment with the Dead Sea area. Perpetually burning fire, a furnace of fire, columns of smoke rising day and night, and ash and tar and sulfur and salt, because it was a constant reminder that they could still see with their own eyes. And the term that came to be used to refer to the physical historical location of the Dead Sea area is the Lake of Fire. because it was a lake, a body of water that was dead. Nothing could live in it. And it was perpetually burning, at least in the early years. It was literally a lake of fire. So lake of fire became a Hebrew idiom that was used, and when people heard it, they knew it was a reference to the historical location where the judgment of Sodom had occurred, and metaphorically, divine judgment such as had been expressed in that area. When I learned this, I was shocked. I grew up in the church, which taught me that the lake of fire was a literal afterlife location where God threw sinners to burn them forever. And even in the last several years, in Universalist circles, I had still never heard anything like this. I've heard several different explanations for the lake of fire, but nothing like this. I probably would have met it with a bit of skepticism if I hadn't heard it first from Brad Jersak, who is my favorite and most respected pastor. And I have to give credit to his book, Her Gates Will Never Be Shut, for first turning me on to this information. After having done my own research on this topic, it became clear to me that the evidence that the term lake of fire is a Hebrew idiom referring to the judgment that happened in the Dead Sea area is overwhelming. As it turns out, the lake of fire, just like the fire of Gehenna, has to be understood within historical context. The implications here are huge and change everything about our understanding of the Revelation's passages. In the next video, we will dive more deeply into how the language of the destruction of Sodom came to be understood as a reference to divine judgment. And more importantly, if the lake of fire should be understood as a literal lake of fire where God throws people to torment them forever. Don't forget to talk to me in the comments. Be loved, be happy, be at peace, and thank you for watching.